I wasn't supposed to hear it. I want to say that clearly, up front, because for a long time afterward I kept trying to convince myself I'd misunderstood something, that there was context I didn't have that would make the sentence make sense in some innocent way. There wasn't any missing context. I've replayed it enough times since that I could probably transcribe it word for word if you asked me to. I heard exactly what I heard. I'd driven 40 minutes to my parents' house on a Thursday night to drop off a birthday gift for my father, a watch I'd spent 3 separate paychecks on because he'd mentioned once, offhand, months earlier, that his old one had finally stopped keeping time and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. I let myself in through the side door the way I'd done my whole life, through the mudroom that still had my height marked in pencil on the doorframe from when I was 9 years old, next to a mark for my sister that stopped a full 2 inches higher than mine because our father had, apparently, measured her standing on her toes once as a joke and never bothered to fix it. I heard voices from the kitchen before I even reached the hallway, and I stopped, not out of suspicion at first, just the ordinary pause anyone makes before walking into a conversation already in progress. My mother's voice, low, using the tone she reserves for when she believes a door is fully closed. My sister's voice, laughing a little, easy, the way you laugh at something that isn't actually funny so much as it is familiar and comfortable. And then my father's voice, matter of fact, almost bored, the way you'd confirm logistics for a trip you'd taken a dozen times before. Don't worry about it, he said. We'll trick her like always, and she'll give us everything. She always does. I stood in that mudroom for what felt like a very long time. Long enough that my legs actually started to ache from standing so still. Long enough to hear my sister say, "Just don't make it obvious this time. She caught on a little last year, remember, with the car repair thing." And long enough to hear my mother laugh, an actual full laugh, and say, "She never really catches on. She just decides not to say anything about it." He meant it as a private joke between the three of them, a comfortable little shorthand for how predictable I apparently was, how reliably the machinery worked. It would turn out to be the last time any of them got to make that joke about me without consequence. Would I walk into that kitchen and pretend, the way I always had, that I'd heard nothing at all? Or was this the night I finally stopped being the reliable punchline in my own family's private joke? If you've ever found out that the people who are supposed to protect you the most had an actual name for how easy you were to use, stay with me, because I'm going to tell you exactly what trick her like always turned out to mean, in specific dollar amounts, and exactly what I did once I finally understood the shape of it. If any part of this sounds familiar to you already, go ahead and like this video and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I answer every single one, and it genuinely helps to know I'm not the only one this has happened to. I need to back up here, because "she never catches on, she just decides not to say anything" is a sentence that only makes real sense if you understand exactly what my role in this family had been for 29 years running. I was the one who paid off my brother's car loan in full when he lost his job 2 years ago and didn't ask for a payment plan in return. I was the one who quietly covered the difference when my parents' mortgage payment came up short one particularly bad winter, wiring the money the same afternoon they mentioned it. No questions, because asking questions felt like something a suspicious person would do, and I had never once in my life wanted to be the suspicious one in this family. I was the one who Venmo'd my sister rent money just this once on 4 separate occasions that I can specifically remember, each one presented as an emergency, each one somehow never quite paid back the way it was promised. Every single time, it arrived wrapped in the exact same packaging, a family emergency, a promise that it was temporary, and a peculiar kind of gratitude that always, eventually, curdled into me feeling guilty for having asked, even gently, when the money might be returned. I had never once, before that night in the mudroom, thought of any of it as a trick. I had thought of myself as the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who could be counted on, and I had taken a certain quiet pride in that identity, the way you take pride in something you've never examined too closely. Standing in that mudroom with my father's voice still hanging in the air, I understood, all at once and completely, that responsible had simply been the word my family used, among themselves, for reliable mark. I almost walked in and said absolutely nothing. That was the old pattern, worn smooth from 100 repetitions. Swallow it, smile, hand over the money eventually anyway because it was easier than the alternative, which was a fight I genuinely didn't know how to have without feeling, immediately and completely, like the villain of the story. Old habit had already started composing my exit line for me, something easy and forgettable, something that would let me walk in, hand over the watch, and leave with the last 5 minutes of my life quietly filed away and never spoken of again. What actually stopped me, in the end, was a conversation I'd had 2 months earlier with my coworker Dana, during a slow overnight shift, about her own complicated family. She told me, almost as an aside while restocking supplies, not realizing how much weight the sentence would eventually carry for me. The year I stopped loaning my brother money was the year he finally started calling to talk to me instead of just calling to ask me for something. At the time, I remember just nodding along, filing it away as a nice sentiment that didn't especially apply to my own situation. Standing in that mudroom 2 months later, her sentence came back to me whole, unprompted, and it landed like something I had always known somewhere underneath, but had never once let myself say out loud. I walked into the kitchen. "Say that again," I said. "The part about tricking me." The silence that followed had an actual texture to it, thick enough that I could feel it against my skin. My mother's face didn't do surprise. It did calculation, fast and visible, the same look she gets when a plan hits an obstacle it hadn't budgeted for in advance. My father set his coffee mug down very slowly and very deliberately, like the sound of it clinking against the counter might somehow be used as evidence against him later. "You weren't supposed to," my sister started, then stopped herself, which told me everything I needed to know about how deliberate the whole thing had actually been. "I know I wasn't supposed to hear it," I said. "That's kind of the entire point, isn't it? What's the trick this time? Since I always fall for it." My father tried the tone first, the one that had worked on me reliably since I was a teenager, patient, faintly wounded, delivered like I was the one being unreasonable for questioning it at all. "It's not what it sounded like. We were just joking around, blowing off steam." "You said I never catch on. I just decide not to say anything," I said. "That's not a joke, Dad. That's a strategy. You've been running an actual strategy on me, and you've apparently been running it for years." Nobody answered that directly. My mother reached instead for her go-to-move, the guilt reroute she deploys whenever a direct question gets too close to something true. "After everything we've done for you." My Aunt Carol was there too that night, sitting at the far end of the table with a crossword puzzle she'd clearly stopped actually solving several minutes earlier. She didn't take a side loudly, and I don't think she intended to take one at all. But she said, quietly, mostly to her own puzzle rather than to any of us directly, "Might be time somebody said the quiet part back to them, for once." That single sentence told me I wasn't imagining the whole shape of what I'd just walked into. Someone else had seen it too, for longer than I had, and had simply never had a reason before now to say so out loud. I didn't yell, and I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to. What I did instead was drive home that night and, for the first time in 29 years, sit down and write out every single instance I could remember of loaning, gifting, or quietly covering money for members of my family, with dates and amounts reconstructed as accurately as memory and old bank statements would allow. It came to just under $11,000, spread across 6 years. I didn't do it to prepare some kind of invoice to hand them. I did it because I needed to see the actual number written down in black and white to fully believe that my own memory wasn't somehow exaggerating something that had, apparently, felt small enough each individual time to laugh about later, in a kitchen, without me. Over the following weeks, the requests kept arriving exactly the way they always had. My sister needed help with a security deposit on a new place. My mother mentioned, almost too casually over the phone, that the car insurance renewal had just snuck up on them this year. Each time, I said the same 4 words, calmly, without elaboration: "I can't do that." No explanation attached. No negotiation opened. No guilt quietly absorbed on my end the way I'd absorbed it for 6 straight years. My father tried the joking around defense 2 more times over those weeks, softer each time, almost testing, like he was checking whether the door had actually swung fully shut or had just closed on its own weight temporarily. It had closed. Completely, this time. I didn't say anything else that night in the kitchen. I picked up the watch box I'd set on the counter when I walked in, and I left it there, on the counter, unopened, and I drove home without giving my father his birthday gift, which felt, at the time, like the smallest possible act of protest available to me, and also somehow the only one I could manage without my voice breaking. The next morning, my mother called 4 times before I picked up. When I finally answered, she didn't apologize. She explained. That's an important distinction I learned that week, the difference between a person who says sorry and a person who tells you, at length, why you shouldn't have been upset by something in the first place. "You're taking this so out of context," she said. "We were just talking. People say things when they're venting that they don't mean literally." "You don't say she never catches on about someone you respect," I said. "Even venting has a shape. That was the shape of how you actually see me." She tried a few more angles over that call, that I was being sensitive, that eavesdropping wasn't exactly the moral high ground either, that maybe I should think about why I was so quick to believe the worst about my own family. I noticed, listening to her cycle through each one, that not a single version of her response involved actually denying that the plan existed. She was arguing about my reaction to it, not about whether it was true. My sister texted me separately, later that same day, a long message that started with an apology and ended, 3 paragraphs later, with a request for $200 for a car repair, as though the apology had simply been the necessary toll to pay before the actual point of the message could arrive. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time before I answered that one. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that if I said yes to this, today, 3 days after hearing exactly what she thought of my willingness to say yes, I would be proving her right in real time. I wrote back 4 words: I can't do that. No further explanation. No opening for negotiation. It was the first time in longer than I could remember that I'd said no to my sister without immediately following it with a reason, an apology of my own, or an offer of some smaller alternative form of help instead. The silence that followed, on her end, lasted 3 full days before she texted again about something completely unrelated, as if the request had simply evaporated once she understood it wasn't going to work this time. I talked to Dana again that week, at work, during another slow overnight shift, and told her what had actually happened in the mudroom, the whole thing, start to finish. She didn't say I told you so, though she would have been entitled to. She just asked me, how does it feel, saying no without explaining yourself? I told her it felt terrifying and a little bit like flying. She laughed and said that sounded about right, that it had felt exactly the same way for her, the first several times. The real test arrived at a Sunday dinner about a month later, the first one I'd agreed to attend since the mudroom. My mother brought the whole thing up in front of everyone at the table, the way she does when she specifically wants an audience to help her apply pressure, how disappointed she was in me, how family was supposed to help family without keeping a ledger, how she never in her life imagined a daughter of hers would keep score over something as small, in her words, as money between blood relatives. I let her finish the entire speech without interrupting. You're right that it's small, I said, once she was done. $11,000 over 6 years is small enough that none of you thought I'd ever add it up, and small enough, apparently, that you could joke about tricking me out of even more of it, in my own parents' kitchen, without me in the room. I heard you say I never catch on. I caught on. That's what actually changed here. Not how much I'm willing to give my family, whether I'm willing to keep being lied to in order to give it. Nobody had a follow-up ready for that. Not because I delivered some devastating final line the way people do in movies. I don't think I ever raised my voice enough during any of this for it to feel like winning something, but because there simply wasn't a version of family helps family sturdy enough to survive being handed their own exact sentence back to them, word for word, unedited. Things are quieter with my family now, in the specific way that honesty tends to make things quieter instead of louder, at least eventually. My sister still asks me for help sometimes, but she asks now like it's an actual request, something I'm genuinely allowed to say no to, not an entitlement she's simply informing me about in advance. My parents don't joke about tricking anyone in front of me anymore. Not once, not even accidentally. I don't know, honestly, whether that's real growth on their part or just better manners about not getting caught a second time. I've noticed, somewhat to my own surprise, that I've stopped needing to know which one it is before I decide how I'm going to act going forward. A real test of whether anything had actually shifted, rather than just gone quiet for a while out of embarrassment, came about 5 months later, when my father's actual watch, the one I'd left unopened on the counter that night in the mudroom, finally made its way back to me. My mother mailed it, without a note, in the same box I'd bought it in, and I didn't hear anything else about it for almost 2 weeks. Then my father called, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, and the conversation was stiff and short, but at the end of it he said, I shouldn't have said what I said that night. About you never catching on. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't even true anymore, is it? It wasn't a full accounting of 6 years. It wasn't even really an apology in the complete sense. But it was the first time since I could remember that he had acknowledged, out loud, to me directly, that the version of me he'd been counting on no longer existed. My cousin Mira, who I hadn't spoken to much before any of this, reached out a few weeks after the Sunday dinner where everything had come to a head. She'd heard about it secondhand, the way these things travel through a family, and she told me, almost shyly, that she'd overheard something similar once herself, years earlier, involving her own parents and her own reliability with money, and that she'd never said anything about it, had just quietly kept giving, for almost a decade, because she hadn't known it was actually possible to stop. I don't know if I'm brave enough to do what you did, she said. I told her I hadn't felt brave in the moment either. I'd just finally run out of road to keep pretending I hadn't heard what I heard. My sister and I talk less often now than we used to, and I've made a kind of uneasy peace with that. She still asks me for help sometimes, but the asking sounds different now, less like an assumption being confirmed, more like an actual question with a real possibility of no attached to it. Sometimes I say yes. Sometimes I don't. The difference isn't really about the money anymore. It's about whether I'm choosing it, or whether it's simply being extracted from me by people who long ago decided, in a kitchen I wasn't in, that I was too predictable to bother asking properly. I think about that mudroom sometimes, standing there in the dark before I finally walked in. I think about how close I came to letting that entire conversation stay exactly what it was meant to be, a secret, the way I'd let every other version of it stay a secret for 6 quiet years running. I never caught on, they said to each other, laughing. I just decided not to say anything. They weren't wrong about that description, not until the one specific night it finally, actually mattered. If someone in your life has ever counted on you being too kind, too responsible, or too afraid of the resulting fight to ever notice what they were really doing to you, I hope this reached you before the number got anywhere near as high as mine did. And if you've ever overheard something in your own family that permanently changed what you were willing to give them afterward, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I mean that.